Frequency 77.7. Chapter 1. Static After Midnight. The rain had been whispering against the window for hours, a quiet hiss that made the dark apartment feel even more isolated. Dylan sat cross-legged on the floor, the glow of the old transistor radio painting his face in soft amber. He shouldn't have been awake. He definitely shouldn't have been scrolling through the FM dial at 2, 3 a.m., looking for something, anything that wasn't just white noise or late-night talk about crop yields in towns he'd never heard of. But then he heard it, a clean tone, impossibly clean, slicing through the static. A voice followed, smooth and warm, the kind of voice you feel in your ribs before you even process the words. "Welcome, wanderer, you found us. Frequency 77.7. The hairs on Dylan's arms rose. There was no jingle, no ad, no station ID except that, just the voice, rolling over him like thick smoke. It was telling a story, something about a ship lost at sea, the crew speaking in languages no one had heard before, and eyes that reflected starlight, even in total darkness. The deeper the voice went, the more the room seemed to contract. Shadows pressed closer. His breath slowed without his permission. And then he noticed something strange. The voice wasn't just coming from the radio anymore. It was inside his head, buzzing faintly, like it had slipped into some hidden corridor between thought and sound. Outside, the street was dead quiet. But for some reason, Dylan knew without any proof that somewhere out there, someone else was listening too. Somewhere, other radios had also stopped on 77.7. Chapter 2. The Listeners. The next morning, Dylan tried to convince himself it had been nothing, just a weird late-night broadcast, some indie art project for insomniacs. But when he woke up, his throat ached, deep and raw, as if he'd been speaking all night in a voice that wasn't quite his own. He stood in front of the mirror. His eyes were bloodshot, but that wasn't what made him grip the sink. The pupils seemed not round, more like elongated, almost feline, catching the light in a way they never had before. He told himself to breathe, told himself to stop imagining things. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. One line of text. "You stayed until the end." Dylan's stomach dropped. He hadn't given out his number. He hadn't even called anyone. He put the phone down and backed away from it, as if it might bite. The day felt off-kilter after that. People at work seemed to glance at him longer than necessary. A coworker in the break room asked, "Rough night?" But her voice had a cautious edge, as if she was measuring something in him. That night, the radio called to him again. Not literally, there was no sound in the air, but it pulled at him, like an itch deep in his brain. By 1:50 a.m., he was sitting in the same spot as before. The dial turned to 77.7. The voice returned, warm and low. "Welcome back, wanderer. We knew you'd return." This time, there was music slow, thrumming, like the heartbeat of some enormous animal. The words came between the notes, stories of the listeners, people who had tuned in and been changed. They saw more than the rest of the world. They spoke in ways that bent the thoughts of those around them. The voice promised that soon, Dylan would understand. And even though every part of him screamed to switch the radio off, his hands didn't move. Chapter 3. The Stranger on the Bench. The next evening, Dylan didn't even pretend he wouldn't listen again. He paced the apartment until the hour grew late, restless and wired, counting down the minutes to 1:57 a.m. But before then, he decided to clear his head. He pulled on a hoodie and stepped into the damp midnight streets. The rain had stopped, leaving the world slick and glistening under orange street lamps. At the small park 2 blocks away, he saw her. A woman sitting alone on a wooden bench, knees drawn up, an old silver radio balanced on her lap. She didn't look at him, not until he was close enough to hear the faint murmur of static. "You're one of them," she said softly, without greeting. Her voice carried a strange timbre, like 2 voices speaking in perfect unison. Dylan froze. "One of who?" Her head tilted, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes caught the streetlight in that same unnatural way his had. "The listeners. We can hear it even without the dial. It's in you now, isn't it?" He swallowed. "What is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and handed him a folded scrap of paper. Inside, in jagged pen strokes, was a simple warning. Never listen past the third night. Before he could ask more, she was already walking away, the radio still crackling faintly in her hands. Dylan stood alone in the park, paper trembling in his fingers, the air suddenly colder. That night, when he finally sat down with his own radio, the voice was waiting. "Your friends have already begun to notice the change in you," it murmured. "They don't understand yet, but they will. And by then, you'll be ready." And against his better judgment, Dylan leaned closer. Image prompt. A misty midnight park, under orange street lamps, wet pavement glistening. A mysterious woman in a hooded coat, sitting on a wooden bench with an old silver radio on her lap, her eyes faintly reflecting light in an inhuman way. A man stands frozen in front of her, holding a folded scrap of paper. Chapter 4. The Third Night. By the time the clock hit 1:57 a.m., Dylan was already in his spot, knees drawn up, the radio warm in his lap like a living thing. His heart thudded too fast, not just from anticipation, but from the memory of the woman's warning. Never listen past the third night. The static faded, replaced by that perfect, velvet voice. "Tonight, wanderer, you crossed the threshold." The sound behind the voice had changed. Not music this time, but something that felt like a slow inhale, vast and patient stretching in the background. The voice spoke of impossible places. A desert where the sand whispered your name. A city where the windows looked out onto different worlds. A staircase that spiraled down forever. And then it began to speak to him directly. "You've felt it, haven't you? The way people's words slow when they speak to you now. The way they glance too long. Your voice is changing, Dylan. Soon, you'll be able to shape the answers they give you." A tremor ran through him. "How do you know my name?" he whispered, though he knew, deep down, that the voice had always known. The sound in the background deepened, like something enormous was leaning closer to the microphone. "You could switch us off now," the voice said gently, "and walk away. Remain ordinary." For one suspended moment, Dylan's hand hovered over the dial. The woman's warning echoed in his mind. His heart pounded in his ears. And then the voice whispered, "But ordinary was never enough for you, was it?" His fingers fell away from the dial. The broadcast continued. Chapter 5. The Echo. The next morning, Dylan's voice startled him. It wasn't just deeper, it carried a strange resonance, a subtle vibration that seemed to hum beneath his words. When he spoke to the barista at the corner cafe, she froze mid-motion, eyes unfocused, as though she'd lost her place in the world for a heart. He tested it. "You're going to give me the drink for free?" Her lips moved almost automatically. "Yes, of course." She handed it over without breaking eye contact. Dylan walked out with the cup in hand, pulse hammering. On the way home, a man on the sidewalk stumbled into him. Dylan's annoyance rose like a reflex. And when he said, "You should apologize," the man's expression shifted instantly, shame, almost fear, before muttering a hurried sorry and backing away. The power thrilled and frightened him, but by nightfall, the pull of 77.7 was overwhelming, as if the radio wasn't in his apartment at all, but inside his chest, waiting. At 2:00 a.m., the voice welcomed him as if nothing had changed. "You've taken your first step," it said. "You see now what others cannot, how their words are fragile things, waiting to be molded." The hum in the background was louder now. Not static, not breath, something else. The voice told him of the final night. That's when he would belong fully to the listeners, when his voice would no longer be his own but theirs, and his eyes would see far beyond human sight. A part of him wanted to smash the radio. Another part wanted nothing more than to hear the last broadcast. Chapter 6. The Last Transmission. Dylan didn't even pretend to resist. By 1:59 a.m., he was in the dark, sitting so still that the faint ticking of the kitchen clock felt like a hammer in his skull. The radio's orange dial glowed like an ember. When the static faded, the voice was different. It was quieter, but closer, as if the speaker was leaning right over his shoulder. "Tonight, wanderer, you leave yourself behind." The hum in the background had become voices, many voices, whispering in languages Dylan didn't know, overlapping, weaving into a constant thread of sound that pressed against the base of his skull. The stories tonight weren't about faraway places. they were about him. Every private memory he'd buried, the bad decisions, the small shames, the words he wished he could take back. They came spilling out of the speaker like they'd been hiding there all along. "You've always known you were meant for more," the voice said. "And now you will never be alone again." He felt it before he saw it. A pressure in his eyes, as though something was looking through them. His pupils widened until his vision swam, the room stretching at the edges. The glow from the radio deepened, flickering as if shadows were moving inside it. Somewhere in the sea of whispers, he heard his own voice. Not an echo, but speaking alongside the rest. "Say it," the voice urged. And he did. Words he didn't understand slid from his mouth, curling like smoke into the air. The whispers surged, folding him into their sound. When the broadcast ended, the radio clicked off. The silence was absolute. But Dylan knew he wasn't alone in the room anymore. Chapter 7. The World That Listens Back. Dawn crept in like a stranger. The pale light through Dylan's blinds was too bright, too sharp, like the air itself had been polished overnight. When he stepped outside, the city felt tuned. Every sound carried layers he'd never noticed before. The hum of neon signs, the subtle rhythm of footsteps, the faint pulse of engines idling blocks away. It was all part of one continuous signal, and he could hear it. People reacted to him differently now. Not just with lingering glances they stilled. Conversations faltered as he passed, eyes locking on his like magnets. He could almost feel their thoughts brushing against his own. A subtle static in the air. At the cafe, the same barista from before placed his drink on the counter without him ordering. "You always take 2 sugars, she said dreamily, though he'd never told her that. Her pupils dilated as she stared, and she didn't move until he broke the eye contact. On the street, he tested the reach of his voice. "You'll stop," he said casually to a man halfway across the crosswalk. The man froze mid-step, traffic honking furiously around him, until Dylan waved him on. But with the power came something else, a faint echo in his head that wasn't quite his own thoughts. Sometimes it whispered in that velvet radio voice. Other times, it was a chorus. The listeners were there, speaking through him, under him, around him. The silver-haired woman from the park appeared again that afternoon, leaning against the same bench. "You didn't stop," she said, not accusing, almost pitying. "I didn't want to," Dylan admitted. She nodded. "Then you should know. There's no turning it off now." Chapter 8. The Signals Work. For days, the whispers grew clearer. They came when Dylan was half awake, when his mind was loose and unguarded. At first, they were fragments, instructions that made no sense. Turn left at the red light. Speak to the man in the blue coat. Buy the paper from the stand on 7th. He obeyed without meaning to. The man in the blue coat had eyes just like his. The newspaper carried an ad for a radio repair shop on the edge of the city. The letters in its address underlined in faint red. The shop smelled of dust and solder. An old man sat behind the counter, his own pupils ink black, smiling faintly. "You're here to help us," the man said, as if Dylan had always known. "The signal's range is growing, but there are obstacles." He led Dylan to a back room where half a dozen others sat in folding chairs, each with the same dark eyes. They turned toward him in perfect unison, and the chorus in his head swelled in greeting. "We speak into the world," one of them murmured. "We open the way for what comes next." "What is coming?" Dylan asked, though the answer was already coiling at the edge of his mind. They didn't say it aloud. Instead, the old man placed a small, portable radio in Dylan's hands, newer than his own, but glowing with the same unnatural warmth. "Use this," the man said. "Find the ones who are ready to hear." That night, Dylan walked the streets, tuning the device. The voice on 77.7 flowed out of it in whispers no one else seemed to hear. But some heads turned as he passed, eyes sharpening, steps slowing. He was recruiting, even if he didn't fully understand how. Chapter 9. The Face in the Signal. The night air was sharp and brittle, the kind that seemed to crack when you breathed. Dylan sat cross-legged on his living room floor, the new portable radio in front of him. He didn't know why he felt nervous. He'd listened to 77.7 countless times now. But something in the whispers all week had hinted at this night being different. The broadcast began with no static, just silence. And then a low, resonant note that seemed to shake the walls. "Wanderer," the voice breathed. And for the first time, it wasn't velvet, smooth. It was layered, fractured, like dozens of voices speaking the same words slightly out of sync. The shadows in the room thickened. The orange glow from the radio warped, becoming almost liquid, swirling slowly in the dial's glass face. "Look," the voice commanded. Dylan leaned closer and saw movement inside the glow. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. A face was forming in the swirl, pale, eyeless, its mouth stretched into a slow, impossible smile. It spoke without moving its lips. "The flesh is just a mask. You are more than the mask now." The world outside seemed to dim, as if the city itself was holding its breath. And then the face's expression shifted, not to joy, but to hunger. "You will bring them to me." Dylan's heart hammered. He wanted to look away, but his neck wouldn't obey. The glow deepened until everything else in the room was swallowed by it. When he finally tore himself back, the radio was dark, dead. But in the silence afterward, the face was still behind his eyes. Chapter 10. The Night of Many Voices. The city was quiet in that unnatural way that makes you check over your shoulder. Street lamps flickered, casting long, trembling shadows. Dylan walked slowly, the portable radio warm in his hands, tuned to 77.7. The voice was not speaking to him now, it was speaking through him. Every passerby who heard his step seemed to slow, heads turning toward him. Some followed without a word, their faces blank, their eyes wide. The radio's whispers grew louder, weaving between Dylan's own breaths until he could no longer tell which thoughts were his. By the time he reached the park bench, 24 people stood in a silent half-circle around him. The silver-haired woman was there too, but she didn't look angry. She looked resigned. "It's tonight, isn't it?" she asked softly. Dylan's voice, or the voice inside him, answered, "It's tonight." The radio's glow spilled across the wet grass, brighter and brighter until it painted the faces of the gathered in molten orange. In every pair of eyes, the same black pupils stretched wide, swallowing all light. The hum deepened into that vast inhale he'd heard before. The air seemed to bow inward, and then they spoke, all of them, perfectly in sync, words that didn't belong to human tongues. The ground trembled. Somewhere above the city, clouds shifted unnaturally, revealing not the moon, but something that watched back, something pale and grinning. The voice filled the park, the streets, the very bones of the city. "We are here." When it was over, Dylan didn't remember walking home. But when he passed a store window and saw his reflection, he knew there was nothing left of the man who'd once sat alone, scrolling the FM dial for company. The mask was perfect, but the eyes were not human.